Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on the Fulbright Distinguished Awards in Teaching program. My name is Holly Emmert with the Institute of International Education. Can everybody hear me? If so, please type in the chat box, yes, you can hear me. All of you are muted and will remain muted. Right? Thank you, Andrea, Michael, Jordan, Craig, and others. Fantastic. I'm now going to attempt to unmute our co-presenters, DA program alumna Amy Leau. DA program is what we call this program for short because it's such a long title. Let's see if I can unmute her so she can say hello. Amy, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. Please say hello to everyone.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
All right, and now I'm going to mute you, Amy, for just a few minutes, and I'm going to unmute our other presenter, Timothy McBride from the Fulbright Commission in Connexus. Timothy, can you hear me?
Hi, Holly, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. All right, so everyone can hear you, so feel free to say hello if you'd like.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon.
Wonderful. Okay, so Tim, I'm now going to mute you, and I'll be back to you in just a few minutes. All right, everyone, so let's go ahead and dive in. So for the next hour, we're going to spend our time together giving you information about this Fulbright program with a special focus on Mexico. Mexico, all of our countries are priority countries, but Mexico is one that we would really, frankly, love to see more applicants for or to. So this webinar is an attempt to give more insider information about the program in that country and to answer any questions you may have, those of you on the webinar, about the program overall or about the program in Mexico specifically. My name is Holly Emmert. I am the program lead for this program at the Institute of International Education. We administer this program on behalf of the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. If you have any questions, please note that we're going to wait until the end of the webinar to address any questions you may have. If you do have questions at any time, please go ahead and enter them into the chat or question box, whatever you have available to you as you're logged in, and we will address those individually at the end. Please note that this webinar is being recorded because there are several individuals who are not able to participate right now, but who would benefit from the webinar. So it will be recorded. And then the last thing I'd like to say is, again, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend today or to listen on your own time. So let's go ahead and begin the content of the session. So just a quick overview of this program. You may or may not be familiar with the Fulbright program broadly defined, but this is a program funded by the U.S. Congress through an annual appropriation and sponsored by the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, administered by the organization I work for, IIE. The overall goal of the Fulbright program, and thus also the DA program, again, which is what we call the program for short, is to improve mutual understanding among teachers, their schools, both in the U.S. and abroad, and communities, not just educational communities, but the communities you live in, through offering intensive professional development for educators and teachers, whether they are classroom teachers, for example, teaching Spanish full-time, or ESL or EFL, or in some cases, our participants may be teacher trainers, or they may be instructional support, such as media specialists, that sort of thing. So this program is open to all those audiences. For this particular Fulbright program, again, there are many, many different types of Fulbright programs for students, university faculty, teachers. This particular Fulbright program is specifically for primary and secondary and K-12 teachers. The program that you are applying for, the 2015-2016 program, will mark the 7th year of the program. So it's a fairly young program. We're improving it every year, adding new information, and sometimes the State Department adds new countries, which is exciting. So it is a fairly young program. As I just mentioned, teachers of all subjects and other instructional staff are eligible. Teachers go abroad at any time during the academic year, so that tends to be beginning in September through the following and summer, usually in July, but it can vary. U.S. teachers may go abroad for 3, 4, 5, or 6 whole months, according to the eligible program dates of whichever country they are selected for. So for Mexico, you are able to go abroad either from September through December 2015 for this program year. So that could be 3 months, okay, September, October, November, or 4 months, September, October, November, December. You could also go abroad to Mexico in that range between January and June 2016. All right. And as you are likely more than a little aware, the application deadline this year is November 5th. For those of you who may be reapplicants, it is earlier than in previous years, and that's because we found that we would like to give U.S. applicants and international applicants information about selection earlier in the school year, just because you have to make your own plans and your own decisions about the following year in terms of sabbaticals and things such as that. So you see the entire list of program countries here. Again, Mexico is our focus today, but you see this program operates throughout the world. It's not just one particular region. So on your application, you can choose up to 4 countries. For your capstone, or excuse me, your inquiry project proposal, we do ask you to focus on that first choice country because we do try to place people in their first choice country if at all possible. From time to time, people may be selected for their second choice country, rarely their third or fourth, but that can happen. So going on to the next slide, there are 4 primary program components. All of them culminate in the number 4 item on the screen, which is an inquiry project. An inquiry project in past years has been called a capstone project, so you may see that mentioned on our website and elsewhere. But for the next program year, that has been changed to inquiry project because that more accurately summarizes what you're doing abroad. You're inquiring about a topic or a policy or a subject of your own choosing that you're interested in. So in addition to doing this project, which must be a direct practical application to your own classroom or educational practice, you do several things in support of that. And one is that when you're abroad, you're based at a host university. Now, while you can provide information on your application requesting a certain university, explaining why a certain university or universities would be a good placement, the actual selection of the host university is made on our end in partnership with our program partners abroad, such as the Fulbright Commission in Mexico, COMEXUS. And Tim, who is from COMEXUS, will talk about that a little bit later. At the host university, you do audit up to 1 to 2 courses of direct relevance to your project and or inquiry project, or excuse me, project or subject area that you teach or work in. You also visit local schools in the host country, usually 1 to 2 times a week, although the frequency and duration of those visits can vary depending on your own program design. And then both before, during, and after, we also host a professional learning community online with both international and U.S. participants as well as others. And then a little more detail about the inquiry project. Again, it's a synthesis of all you do abroad. The strongest projects demonstrate cross-cultural dialogue, relevance and applicability to education both in the U.S. and your host country. And as you may have already seen in the application, all teachers must choose to focus on either global best practices or developing global competence. Now, what that means for you and your project is for you to decide, but it has to generally fit into one of those two categories. And if you have any questions after this webinar or perhaps during this webinar about those, we'll do our best to answer them. And then finally, your project and your overall program needs to benefit your students, peer teachers, communities when you get back. It's not just about the program. It's about enjoying and learning about or applying what you've done abroad. Excuse me, I had a little technological glitch on this end, so hopefully you didn't see that screen go blank, but we're back up. And then lastly, program benefits. I'm not going to read these lists for you, but take a look. These are just a few of the benefits, both for yourself as a teacher or educator and for your school, both in the U.S. as well as abroad. You see there's a strong component about increasing global perspectives, being able to share your own professional expertise with host country teachers, students, etc., developing further your own leadership skills and networks. Our alumni just rave about the program and what they've been able to do in terms of new connections and such. And maybe Amy can speak to that a little bit later. All right. And now I'd like to introduce Amy Leau, who just came back from Mexico not too long ago. She's going to speak to you a little bit about her experience in Mexico and her program. And then directly after Amy finishes her component, Timothy McBride of Comexis will speak from his perspective about what it takes and what it's like to conduct a DA program in Mexico. Then again, we'll have that question and answer period. And if you have any questions that are not answered today or that you think of after the webinar or when you're viewing the webinar, just send them to us at IIE at fulbrightdat@iie.org. So at this time, I'm going to mute myself and unmute Amy, and then she can take it away. All right, Amy, you should be good to go. Go right ahead.
Holly, can you hear me? I'm having some technical issues with the webinar, so
Okay, can you see the
I can
screen?
hear everything, but my screen's frozen. So I will be looking at the PowerPoint on my own computer and hoping you can click the slides for me.
Okay, so Amy, just so you know, I have the screen is up with your first slide, so just tell me when you need me to go forward and I will.
Okay, great. So as Holly said, I just returned from Mexico in March of last spring. I was there for 6 months starting in September, and I had to jump right back into school, and then luckily had summer break come up pretty quick, and now back into the school year. I am a ESL teacher by training, but this year I'm teaching social emotional learning skills at a K-5 charter school in Minnesota. It's a program that we decided we needed at our school and that I worked to develop over this past summer. And I didn't really start out as a teacher, but ended up that way, and I'm now in my 10th year. So we can click to the next slide, Holly. So why Mexico? Well, I think that one of the biggest takeaways for me when I was in Mexico was the amount of diversity that I discovered. And I don't think many people think of that when they think of Mexico, but it was a wonderful experience because it sort of combines the intense history that you see with current culture. And you can see that there are different communities all over that have their own traditions, their own ways of doing things, and this was such a wonderful experience for me to see. And as many of you probably know, there's still over 50 languages spoken in Mexico, so every small town has their own way of doing things. And the other benefit to all of that is that the people are very warm and welcoming, and so they're more than happy to invite you in, share things with you, and help you get along as you start your journey there. Also, while I was there, the education system was going under major reforms, and I'm sure Tim could mention that, but I'm sure it's still happening. So that was a pretty exciting thing to see and to experience while I was there. So that is still happening. I also feel that the ambiance or the energy of Mexico is very open, and so it allows you for a lot of creativity. It inspires you to think and see things differently than you've ever seen them before, and so that's helpful no matter what your project is about. And finally, as our neighboring country, I do feel that it's important for U.S. citizens to take an interest in Mexico because of the sort of cause and effect relationship we have with them. So in that way, it's very helpful. And then lastly, for me particularly, I work in a school where 95% of our students are Mexican heritage students, whether they're immigrants themselves or maybe their parents were or are. So it was really important for me to go somewhere where it was completely relevant to what I was doing back home. I was able to create connections with many Mexican teachers, students, friends, and to really sort of delve into the culture and be able to come back home and continue building community in my school and sharing what I learned. All right, next slide. So my project ended up being a teacher workshop and a guide that explored basically culture and education specifically. So when I first got there, you know, you kind of land and you have to find your way. So while I was still finding my way and building connections, I did a lot of background research on my topic and used support that I had back in the U.S. in order to get articles and things that I needed. Once I got my connections, I found an appropriate school, luckily, by being connected to a Department of Education employee who was a supervisor of 10 different schools near Puebla, where I was, in a sort of a more rural area. And he took me around to visit 7 of those schools and allowed me to choose the one that I felt was best for my project. So I kind of clung to him because he was one person that really understood what my intentions were for being there and what my project was about. So if you find those people, you hang on to them and they will help you. I also made connections at the university through the classes that I took with the teachers that were in the classes and also the professors. And a couple of them became key interviewees for my project and are featured in my project. Finally, after collecting all the data, I analyzed findings for themes and conclusions and ways that I could share this information back home. And I feel that that's one of the key components of this. I'm not there just for me. I'm there, or I wasn't there for me. I was there to sort of establish this cultural relationship and understanding that I could bring home to my staff back at my school in Minnesota. So once I got home, about a month or 2 later, I presented in a staff workshop the majority of my project, and I'm still working on many pieces of it, and we'll be presenting next week in Puebla for the next TESOL conference. It's teachers of English to speakers of other languages, so basically the Mexican English Teachers Conference, and then also at the Minnesota TESOL this November. Next slide. Just a few more project notes on things that happened while I was there. I had a great intention of connecting with a rural community, knowing that most of the immigrant population in the U.S. comes from more rural areas than urban areas. So that was important to me to gain that type of experience and connection. I really had to count on my Mexican connections, friends, colleagues that I made while I was there, and once the people that I could explain this project to understood what I was trying to do, which sometimes can be challenging, they really went out of their way to connect me and to help me. One of the professors said, you know, that we're not a written culture, we're more of a verbal culture. So she, you know, that was key information, because she basically said you need to call people, you need to speak to people in person, rather than send emails or other sort of written communication, and so that was key in getting the things that I needed to get my project accomplished. One other fact is that I decided I would collect as much data as possible. I don't really recommend that, but I just felt there was so much relevant information that was happening while I was there to what I do back in the States that I over-collected and felt that I could sift through it later, which I'm still doing 6 months after returning. So, you know, that's up to you, but you do need to have a clear focus for what your initial project will look like. And finally, I will be visiting the students again that I was able to use as participants, and next week when I go back. And so they are very excited to see themselves on video and all the interviews that they did that I'm going to share with them. So next slide. What does a typical day look like when you're doing this project? Well, you don't have to sit and do lesson plans every Sunday, all Sunday, getting ready for the week. You get to wake up, read and research, plan your project, walk around, take in the city where you are, enjoy the different cultural aspects that are there. And then once you get things going, you'll be going to visit your school a couple times a week in order to do observations or interviews or anything else you need for your particular project. And then in the evenings, 1 or 2 times a week, you'll be attending classes, and this is really valuable and important. So even though you're auditing them, you are able to create friendships, professional relationships, and find the people that you really need to connect with. And so that's a very helpful experience. You do have more time than you think to sort of really get involved in where you are, and that is such a valuable part of the experience, to really immerse yourself into the place that you're living, the culture, the food, and the friendships. And finally, I took some Spanish classes, one-on-one Spanish classes, in order to sort of improve the language that I would need to do the interviews, to understand the interviews, to anything I needed. I had this teacher sort of support me in that, and then also just with basic conversational skills and things like that. Next slide. So I would say that some of the highlights from this experience in Mexico were, one, for me, as I mentioned at the beginning, sort of shattering the idea or the stereotypes of what most people understand about what Mexico is. One of the first things I realized was that I could never come back and say this is how education is in Mexico, just as no one could do the same about the United States. It really just depends where you are and what type of school you're in. Also, it was just a brilliant experience in terms of being able to have this inquiry or this idea that you really wanted to know more about, and to actually have the time and the resources to do it. I think most of us, I don't know about everyone, but you know, you tend to go to grad school while you're working, and so it's sort of a race to the finish type thing, and I think that this was really probably one of the best academic experiences I've had in my career. Lastly, just the wonderful aspects of traveling. Speaking Spanish every day and improving it, learning particular Mexican language Spanish. I had learned Spanish in Ecuador and Colombia, and so this was really helpful for me in order to communicate back home with the Mexican families that I work with. And then finally, of course, building friendships and relationships with teachers, students, everybody, taxi drivers, all of it. So it was just absolutely wonderful, and I highly recommend taking the chance to even fill out the application. I discovered that even going through that process, whether I made it into the program or not, really helped me sort of clarify my own passions and interests that I have in my career. And so even if you don't make it, it's still a good exercise and experience to go through and learn from.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Before moving on to Tim at the Fulbright Commission, Comexis, we have one question or two questions that I think it'd be helpful for you to go ahead and answer now. One was a question about your level of Spanish before you went, and also a little more information was requested about what exactly your project topic was. So I'll mute myself now so you can answer those two questions.
Okay, I'm pretty sure. Can you hear me? Can you just respond so I know I should go ahead?
Yes, go right ahead. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Amy?
Okay. So my level of Spanish, I took French in high school and college. So I learned Spanish when I moved to Ecuador for a year as an English teacher overseas, and I was completely immersed in my Spanish there. So my Spanish is pretty high conversationally and comprehension-wise, but probably not as high academically because I didn't take academic courses in Spanish. So those were a couple of things that I wanted support with when I took those Spanish classes, was to make sure I was just forming things grammatically correctly. I have a really good intuition and understanding about language. That's what I do. I'm a language teacher, so I use that talent I have in order to get along, but I would never call myself bilingual. I would say I'm fluent, but still there's always things that are challenging, and you sort of learn them as you're there. And then my project, really what I was intending to do was finding ways to connect families more strongly to our school and to school in general in the United States. We had or I don't know if it's still the highest, but Minnesota has one of the highest Latino achievement gaps in the country. So that was sort of the basis of the need. What is the need that we have here? And so I felt I wanted to take a more humanistic approach to what it is that we do by finding different and more creative ways to connect families into the community. So while I was in Mexico, I explored their system of education in order to better relate to the parents and understand what their experiences might have been like. And then I used that information to help our teachers at school know more about where our parents are coming from and their perspectives, both educationally but also culturally. So that's sort of the gist of it.
Great, thank you, Amy. So Amy, I'm going to mute you now so we can move on to Tim at Comexis. So please hold on, and at the end of the webinar, I'll unmute you as well as Tim to answer any questions we may have. All right? All right, Tim, I've given you control of the keyboard, so please go ahead and start your presentation. Tim, are you there? Tim, I can't hear you.
Let me try this again. Good afternoon, everyone. Are you able to hear me now?
We are able to hear you, so I'm now going to mute myself. Go right ahead.
Fantastic. Thanks, Holly and the Global Teacher Programs Division at IIE for organizing this event. Thank you to Amy for participating. Look forward to seeing you next week at Next TESOL. Certainly, thank you to everyone who's logged in, interested in hearing about the DA program and Mexico as a destination. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to be able to provide some more information. As Holly mentioned, my name is Tim McBride, and I'm the Program Officer for Teacher Programs here at the Fulbright Commission in Mexico. I just want to take a couple minutes to talk a little bit about what we do as a commission, our role in the Distinguished Award in teaching, why Mexico, again, to reiterate a little bit of what Amy said, is a good destination, and kind of what projects might be feasible in Mexico. As Holly discussed in the beginning of the webinar, Fulbright, the Fulbright program has a long history of promoting mutual understanding through exchange diplomacy, and there have actually been grantees to and from Mexico since almost the creation of the program. COMEXIS actually has a little bit of a shorter history, having been established in the early 90s. There we go. Through a bilateral agreement between the governments of the two countries. So since 1992, the U.S.-Mexico Commission for Educational and Cultural Exchange, also known as COMEXIS for the Spanish abbreviation, is the Fulbright Commission here in Mexico, and we administer more than a dozen programs for both U.S. and Mexican grantees. Like IIE and other program partners, our mission is to promote and strengthen relations specifically between the U.S. and Mexico, and each year there are approximately 100 grantees, Fulbrighters from each country studying, teaching, conducting research, or participating in professionalization programs in the other country. And since its inception, nearly 3,500 Mexican grantees and nearly 1,800 U.S. grantees have benefited from a Fulbright grant to and from Mexico. Perfect. Looks like there's just a little bit of a delay when I change slides, so my apologies to everyone. Over the course of the year, certainly we've grown a strong alumni network on both sides of the border. Certainly, like the Fulbright family around the world, it includes an accomplished group of individuals in arts, academia, the civil, private, and political worlds. The current Foreign Minister of Mexico is actually one of our alumni, former U.S. Representative Gabrielle Giffords, who's actually on the Fulbright Scholarship Board at this point, is also a alumna of the Fulbright program in Mexico. But turning to more recent events, there's been significant and renewed attention on education and educational exchanges here in Mexico. As Amy mentioned, the current administration has embarked on an ambitious reform agenda which actually has imposed a lot of changes on the educational system, including a new teacher evaluation and professional development system. Bilaterally, Presidents Obama and Peña Nieto announced the Bilateral Forum on Higher Education, Innovation, and Research, known as FOBESI for its Spanish initials, in May of 2013. This forum was officially opened by Secretary of State Kerry and Foreign Minister Fulbright alumni Meade in May of 2004 this year. But I think I mentioned this because this renewed attention has really strengthened and broadened current initiatives, while providing an impetus for new programs and new opportunities. The 100,000 Strong in the Americas initiative, which started in 2011, was designed to send 100,000 U.S. students to Latin America and the Caribbean region, while receiving just as many Latin American and Caribbean students in the U.S. Kind of in response to this renewed attention, the Mexican government's iteration or version of this is Proyecto 100,000, which again hopes to really increase the number of educational exchanges between the two countries. This next slide, if it changes, hopefully will give you a sense of the number of organizations, the actors that are involved. So there are Mexican institutions, governmental, as well as academic. There are U.S. agencies, the Embassy, the Regional English Language Office, Education USA who are involved. And then there are binational organizations like COMEXIS that are really kind of contributing to this effort. My point here is just that there's a lot going on in Mexico in education these days, and it really highlights the importance and the relevance of programs like the Fulbright Distinguished Awards in Teaching program in both directions. As Holly mentioned, we're the in-country administrators of the Fulbright grants here in Mexico. And so at the same time that U.S. grantees are being recruited, we're doing similar work here in Mexico, coordinating the nomination and application process of Mexican grantees to be able to go to the U.S. later in the year. Once selected, U.S. grantees, as Holly mentioned, will work with us when it comes to placement and also some of the other in-country logistics, including information about housings, visas, and the local information necessary to really begin that program. That placement is really based on the preferences that we see expressed in the application. Regional connections, existing connections, and certainly the resources and specialties of the different host institutions. We certainly take all this into account as we try to make the best match possible. To give you a little bit of an example, Amy actually was placed at a host institution in Puebla, and in her application she talked a little bit about wanting to be able to work better with the Mexican immigrant population in her host school. So we took a look at some of the immigration numbers, the flow, and from where in Mexico immigrants to Minnesota were from, and Puebla was certainly at the top of the list to hopefully provide some of that local knowledge she was looking for. To give you a sense of some of the projects that might be feasible, I wanted to put up a list of some of the priority areas that we've identified, but I certainly want to be very clear this is by far not an exhaustive list. I want you to think of it more of as a starting point for topics that might be valuable for the inquiry project. The diversity of Mexico, as Amy mentioned, and its educational institutions and opportunities certainly provides for a significant amount of flexibility when developing your project proposal. So just looking at some of the topics on this screen, Mexico actually has a long history of distance learning. The telesecundaria program has brought classroom lessons into under-resourced areas. Service learning is certainly an opportunity here, both in Mexico City and the south of Mexico. There's a burgeoning civil society. Inclusive education, as Amy mentioned, that diversity, linguistically, culturally, needs to be accounted for and adjusted for in the classroom. Teaching English to young learners. In 2010, Mexico actually made English instruction at the primary level mandatory, and that now, 4 years later, is being transitioned to a state level program. Different states are taking different interest and interest in how they implement it, so there's certainly quite a bit to research in that sense as well. Back to the diversity, Spanish being taught as a second language, CLIL, CBTs, particularly in science education, is certainly a big topic in Mexico here as well. Promotion of sports and healthy food in schools, and also understanding of Mexican culture in order to increase community involvement in student education. I think an area of concern maybe on both sides of the border is dropout or completion rates, especially at the high school level. And then I think what's kind of interesting, coming full circle, my first comment was about the distance learning and using technology in the telesecundaria program. Despite that history, there certainly are still challenges of integrating ICT into classrooms, and that's certainly an area that's ripe for research. To give you a sense of kind of what that long list of topics might mean in practice, this is a summary of what research is being conducted this year by our 3 USDA grantees currently here in Mexico. So one, for example, grantee in Guadalajara is looking at the effect of after-school athletic activities on academic achievement in and outside the classroom for at-risk urban youth. Another teacher is building a language arts curriculum based on videos and how basically the natural world and our interaction with nature impacts our identity. This teacher is actually from a small school in the Midwest where K through 12 are all in the same building, and now she's in a small school in the Yucatan Peninsula, in a very diverse town where she's able to conduct her research. I think what's noteworthy, and there are a lot of noteworthy parts of all of these projects. She actually comes from a school with a very small Hispanic population. It's a small school, so maybe percentage-wise it's comparable, but there's only, I believe, if I remember correctly, there was only one Hispanic student in her school. But the intercultural opportunities of Mexico made it a good location for her research. Last but not least, a science teacher wants to build a curriculum based on case studies that she develops looking at sustainable agriculture programs here in Mexico, really taking advantage of the global leadership Mexico is showing in a lot of environmental issues. Just to kind of round out my presentation, I wanted to just give a couple more considerations, a couple more things to think about as you look at your application. The first, I think, is fairly obvious, but I think it's worth addressing if you do apply for this program. If you are selected, if you do join us here in Mexico, be prepared that many people will ask you a lot about safety and if you're going to be safe. And I think it's really important to understand that you will be. One of the reasons I came to Mexico was because of to research the public diplomacy challenges that this country faces. There's so much going on here, but a lot of that good news doesn't necessarily get reported in the media. So, for example, the Yucatan has a similar crime rate to Scandinavia. Mexico City is safer than many other cities in the hemisphere, including some cities in the U.S. But I think on top of that, I also want to make clear that all of our placements are made in accordance with the most recent State Department travel advisory for Mexico. These advisories, these warnings, if you will, are available on the State Department website and really do a good job of being detailed and sophisticated in making travel recommendations based on particular states and cities as opposed to a blanket recommendation. So, you know, you'll be going to places that are considered safe by the U.S. government. A quick note to also about that language ability. Like Amy said, you know, I think that high intermediate level of conversational Spanish is really important to be able to take advantage of the academic and community opportunities. And then finally, really just to echo a lot of what Amy said, I want to make a quick note about the value of the experience here in Mexico. I think because of proximity, Mexico can often be overlooked as a destination of able to provide a valuable intercultural experience. And I think we see this play out a lot when you look at study abroad numbers for undergraduate students who often go to Spain or maybe think about Argentina first. And while it's certainly true that the U.S. and Mexico shares an inordinate number of ties, economic, historical, cultural, political, and social, you know, I think as Amy attested to, the diversity and the possibilities and the flexibility and the opportunities here make it a wonderful location for a Fulbright program that can be just as exotic or foreign as other locations. That's the end of my formal presentation. Thank you again to Holly and Amy and all of you interested in Mexico and the DA program. I want to turn it back over to Holly, and I think we get to go to some questions.
That's great. Thank you, Tim. So I'm going to mute you just for a moment, Tim, and then I'm going to answer a couple of the questions that I'm best able to answer, and then I'll open it up for you and Amy to answer a few of the other questions. So just a couple of, first of all, thank you everyone for your questions. Keep those coming. A couple of questions I want to address first from the program management side here at IIE. And also let me say, in case it wasn't clear, IIE is the administrating partner. We manage the program for all of the participating countries in partnership with Fulbright commissions such as COMEXUS in Mexico, our program partners in Botswana, in Finland, etc. So we kind of have the umbrella role there. So let me go to the first question. One really excellent question, thank you, is if selected, must the teacher, the U.S. teacher, for those of you on the webinar, most of you are U.S. teachers, does your U.S. school have to also host a Mexican exchange teacher. So that is actually not the program design of the Fulbright Distinguished Awards in Teaching program. In the past, there was another Fulbright program for teachers that was a true exchange program. It was the Fulbright Classroom Teacher Exchange Program. That program is currently not being offered. So for this program, each teacher who is selected, let's say that you choose to go to Mexico and are selected for Mexico from January to March of 2016, you would go individually as your own person. Your program may overlap other U.S. teachers in Mexico. It's most likely to overlap U.S. teachers going to other countries. For the international teachers who come to the U.S., the program design is a little bit different than for the U.S. in that international teachers all come to the U.S. as a true cohort. They all are together at one U.S. host university each fall. So U.S. teachers go abroad individually, whereas international teachers are here international teachers are in the U.S. together, whereas U.S. teachers can go abroad depending on their program dates. Another question that was asked is how many DAs, meaning distinguished teachers, will be awarded. You know, it really varies each year primarily based on quality of applications, goodness of fit to the first choice country. One thing that I think is very important for those of you on the webinar now or listening to the recorded webinar to hear is that every year we receive several excellent applications, fantastic inquiry project proposals, wonderful experience and goals for the program. But they don't move forward in the review process because they don't have to leave their home country to do their project. So whatever inquiry project you propose, whether it's for Mexico or another country, make sure you have to actually leave the U.S. and be in that country to conduct the project. That's very important. It's a basic criteria that some people miss, unfortunately, each year. So the quality and fit of the project to the country or countries proposed is a #1 criteria or criterion. In terms of the actual numbers of international teachers or U.S. teachers chosen, it also depends on other factors such as funding available, the ability of that country and host universities to host a certain number of teachers. So I would say don't focus on the number of available spots. Focus on developing a project proposal that taps into something you're passionate about, that you really would benefit from a time away from full-time teaching to explore, so that when you go back to the classroom or your educational role, you can really implement it in a way that benefits your students, peer teachers, etc. All right. So I'm now going to unmute both Amy and Tim, and I will share that with them a couple of the questions we heard, and then they can respond. So one of the first questions, and Tim, why don't you start, and then Amy, you can follow with a response, was, are there any challenges being a woman in Mexico? So Tim, why don't you start as a Comexis rep, and then Amy, as a woman, you can speak to that.
Okay.
That's a really interesting question. I don't think that there are more challenges to being a woman in Mexico necessarily in any other country, outside the fact that you are in a different context, a different culture, and gender relations are different. I definitely would look forward to hearing Amy's response, but I wonder if the question more is in terms of safety, and again, we really work hard to make sure that people are in safe areas. But I think outside of the kind of cross-cultural differences, I don't think that there would be any particularly extra challenges associated with gender here in Mexico?
Okay. First, just to speak a little bit about safety. I felt completely safe in Puebla, but I also took really common sense precautions in terms of not walking around at night by myself in different places. And even my friends there would recommend that that's not a smart thing to do. So, you know, I just took care of myself, and I live in a big city here, kind of in the same way. So, and in terms of gender relations, definitely they're different. You will have interactions and experiences that you would not have in the United States, or maybe less frequently, and that would probably, just to be frank and honest, we're talking about attention that you may get when you're walking down the street or in certain places. It doesn't feel threatening. It's more of something that you just sort of deal with because it's a difference. So you may get attention put on you or comments made to you or things like that, but you just handle them in a reasonable way. There isn't really anything to be afraid of. So, you know, it's part of the experience, I guess. Unless there's a more specific question about that, I'd be happy to answer. That's what I can think of off the top of my head right now.
Thank you both, Tim and Amy. A few other questions. Okay, we had several questions about the ability of Spanish necessary, but Tim, you answered that. The project or the program design is such that you are the engine of your own program. So while we set up with Comexis a framework, you know, we help you find a host university and contacts there. They help you find local schools. We give you clear guidelines about what you're expected to do while on program. Other than that, it's really up to you to decide what and when to do it. And so Spanish is necessary for that. So Amy, can you speak to that at all, about the need to have conversational Spanish and what that looked like in your day-to-day life there?
Sure. My level of Spanish when I returned from Ecuador was pretty conversationally fluent, enough that I was a bilingual education assistant in public schools here in Minnesota while I was getting my teaching license. So, you know, I still would have words that I need to look up and things like that, but I was able to hold my own. Now, I would say that over the years, that was probably 10 years before I went to Mexico, or maybe 11 or 12. So I knew that while I still use Spanish pretty frequently in my school with parents or things like that, that it would take a little bit of work on my end. And so I would say the first couple of months I was there, I did have to work really hard at just regaining some of the things I had lost. So that is why I decided to take some classes just to help me keep practicing as much as possible. So I'll say I was nervous about trying to explain the depth of what I was trying to do with my project, and I would write it out ahead of time or run it by somebody who I knew was bilingual or a native Spanish speaker to get their feedback on it. So if you're concerned about that, you know, I don't know, you probably just need to ask yourself, are you able to communicate your purpose, your interview questions, and understand all the responses that you need? So I guess you'll have to, you know, kind of figure that out for yourself.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and put up the website address here. It's with about 6 minutes left. A couple other questions, a couple that I will answer. One question is, when are we expected to compile and write up all of your data that you collect while you're abroad? For U.S. teachers, so you have program dates. So you have your program start date when you go to Mexico and your program end date when your program officially ends. And you may decide to travel in Mexico or elsewhere for a week or so or whatever after your program officially ends. That's fine. That's a discussion we would have at that time. But for U.S. teachers, whenever or whatever your final program date is, let's say it's July 1st, all U.S. teachers have 30 days from that final program end date, whether you go back to the U.S. immediately or stay abroad. You have 30 days to put all your data, etc., into your final inquiry project form. And then we also have you do what we call a summative report, which is basically an executive summary of your program. It's far too early to go into the details of what that comprises right now, but know that you have 30 days from your program end date to finish the program requirements and to send them to us at IIE. All right. One other question, how specific and well-planned does your inquiry project topic and proposal need to be? If you haven't yet looked at that section of the application, I think that will answer the question for you. It's a fairly detailed application. You have to provide very clear methodology, what methods will you use, interviews, surveys, things like that. What is your implementation plan, as well as you know it, at the time of application. If you're going to do X, what will you do in the first few days or weeks upon arrival? How will you get whatever type of data you're looking for? What is that implementation plan? What does it look like? Now, we know that once you go abroad, realities of being on the ground will in most cases have you or force you to kind of adjust your project so it's a better fit, but it needs to be a solid plan on the application, or it's unlikely to move to the final stages. We suggest strongly that once you've written a solid draft or have your final version, have several people, including those unfamiliar with your topic, read it over to make sure, one, it makes sense, it flows well, etc. Okay? So I'll stop there. Tim, we had a question about generally when do Mexican university semesters start and end? So before you respond to that, I will say that program dates for each country are chosen generally to correspond to when schools and universities are in session. So that work has already been done. But Tim, please provide any insights or comments about Mexican universities that you'd like to.
Sure. As Ali mentioned, one of the reasons we looked at the program dates was because they coincided generally with the academic calendar here in Mexico. So all of the pre-tertiary schools public schools are all on the exact same calendar. Universities generally start at the end of August, the beginning of September, and then go through December. Universities can vary, for example, winter vacation can be anywhere from only 2 weeks to up to 6 weeks. So that will delay a little bit the start date in the spring, which can be January or February, and generally goes through May to the beginning of June. Public schools, pre-tertiary, again, will go through July. So generally it's similar to dates in the U.S.
Thank you, Tim. A few other quick questions. Can a native speaker of Spanish participate? Absolutely. If you meet all the eligibility criteria, you're eligible to participate. One follow-up question to that was if a goal of this program is to increase linguistic fluency in a language. No, that is not a goal of this particular program. This program is meant to provide intensive professional development of relevance to teaching for eligible educators, period. Okay, and also to increase mutual understanding among people of different cultures. But this is not a language program per se at all. That's often a benefit, but not a goal outright. Let's see, other questions. Okay, Tim and Amy, you may be able to answer this. Tim, probably more so. We had a question about a suitable project. Someone is interested in studying arts that aren't necessarily integrated into Mexican schools. Can they do that? I'll start by saying as long as you make them relevant to what you teach in K-12 education, generally it would be relevant. Tim, from the Mexican perspective, what would you say?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Holly about that relevancy to the classroom back in the U.S. I gave the example earlier of the DA teacher who's building a science curriculum based on sustainable agricultural programs. So she'll be in a university that has a sustainable agricultural program as well as an education school, but the goal is actually to do a little bit of traveling in the area to specific programs and projects of sustainable agriculture that really aren't connected to a school at all in Mexico. So a similar model could be followed for an art project, for example.
All right, so with that, time has been reached and we want to be very sensitive to everybody's schedules. I will just say many of the questions that we did not get to can be answered by looking at the program website carefully, www.fulbrightteacherexchange.org. For example, there are samples of what we used to call the inquiry projects, called capstone projects. So there are several examples there of past projects in several of the countries. You can also look on the application section of the website for other application resources such as tips for filling out the application, etc. If you have any questions whatsoever, please send them to us at fulbrightdat@iie.org. Even if you have a question for Amy or for Tim specifically, send that to us and then we will relate that to them as needed and necessary. But other than that, I would just like to say thank you, Tim of Comexis. Thank you, Amy of Minnesota, our teacher alumna, very much for your participation. Any final words?
I do have one last piece of advice about the application that I thought of, which is I would have someone who has a higher education degree, such as a PhD, review what you've written, and they can help you to understand where your methods might not be clear or things might not be clear. So that's all I have to say about that.
Okay. And Amy, as from my perspective, I just also have to say I think that's a really good tip. But you don't have to have a PhD or be a capital A academic at all to have a successful proposal. I think it is helpful, what Amy said, to have someone just take a look to see if your methods make sense and such. But it's certainly not something that you should feel nervous about or that you have to be very academic, because that's certainly not the case. Tim?
Well, I just wanted to say thank you again to Holly and IIE for organizing this webinar, and thank you to everyone who's shown interest. You see the number of attendees, so it's definitely great to see so many numbers. We look forward to seeing applications and welcoming you to Mexico. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you everyone. We're now going to end this webinar. It will be posted online in the next few days, so if you want to listen to it again, feel free. Thanks all. Have a great evening. Good night.
Good night.